morning, Ms. Hoffman. Good morning, everybody.
Morning, DCJ.
Are you ready?
Yes, we are indeed, Chair.
Yes.
Chair, if I may, by way of introduction, set out what we propose to cover today. As introductory matters, I would like to address first the approach that will be taken to the Brockfontein evidence. Secondly, to deal with a few procedural matters, and then to give you an overview of that evidence.
Yes, thank you.
Chair, in terms of the approach to the evidence in relation to Brockfontein, what we propose to do is to begin with a snapshot of what the evidence in totality will show over the course of a number of days of evidence in relation to Brockfontein. Chair, we propose that that will be a useful way to begin the evidence, for a number of reasons. The first is that there will be 3 witnesses who will give oral testimony, but their testimony will be broken up over a series of days because of the need in the schedule to adjust it for travel arrangements and other matters relating to witnesses. So it won't be a situation where it can run consecutively for a number of days, and so we don't want to lose the threads between the evidence, and so an overview initially we propose is useful. The second reason for providing the overview, Chair, is that it is not usually the case, we submit, that state capture announces itself with headlights. It in fact reveals itself through the insidious and incremental undermining of institutions. And it shows itself through the movement for private benefit of public funds and through the appropriation of power and decision-making from those who should wield it to those who stand outside of state organs. And what the Brockfontein evidence shows when it is considered across its full canvas is that those elements of state capture were apparent and real in the context of the Brockfontein coal supply agreement with Tegeta. So, Chair, with your leave, I will commence with an overview once I've dealt with the procedural aspects. Chair, in terms of the procedural aspects.
Okay, maybe let's deal with the procedural aspects and then we'll go back to the overview a bit before you go into it.
Certainly. Chair, in terms of procedural aspects, there are 4 reports that have come to the Commission's attention that have already been done on the question of this coal supply agreement. They are reports by National Treasury in March 2017. They are a report by Fundudzi of November 2018, and then there are 2 PwC reports in November 2015 and November 2016. Those appear in what is called File 5 of U4, which is before you today. The approach that's been taken to those existing reports in the course of the investigation is the following. They were used as a basis for investigation where they revealed important aspects of the factual story. They were investigated further and, where appropriate, corroborated, but they were also interrogated. And there are occasions where we have identified errors in them, and we will advise you of that in the course of the presentation of the evidence. So they form a background to the way the investigation was proceeded with. The second thing at the level of process, and just to orientate you, Chair, is that the Public Protector's report on state capture dealt with Brockfontein in a very cursory manner. If you consider the report, what really happens in it in relation to Brockfontein is that there are summaries of some of the documents which the Public Protector considered, which referenced Brockfontein, and then there is a recordal of Acecom's response to the questions around Brockfontein. That response was in the following terms. Acecom is recorded in the Public Protector's report as having said, at the time of the conclusion of the coal supply agreement with Tegeta in relation to its Brockfontein resource, all contractual documents, information, and approvals had been provided. Chair, we will show you through the course of the evidence that that is false. That is not what occurred in the Brockfontein coal supply agreement. I will also, at an appropriate point, refer you to what was presented in evidence yesterday through Mr. Mabuza, which was the chairman's response in anticipation of the carte blanche interview about the Brakfontein coal supply agreement with Tegeta. And we will show again that what the chairman said in that media statement is false insofar as it relates to Brakfontein. Chair, as I mentioned earlier, the evidence will be presented through the testimony of 3 witnesses. One of them will appear today, and the other 2 will appear next week, Friday. By the conclusion of Friday, we should have completed the Brakfontein story. There is the evidence of a further witness who provided a statement to the Commission, and that is the evidence of Dr. Mark van der Riet. Dr. van der Riet sadly cannot give evidence because he passed away a matter of days after providing his statement to the Commission. I therefore propose in the appropriate point in the chronology of the story to take you to his affidavit and to highlight the relevant parts of it. Chair, what is relevant in relation to Dr. van der Riet's statement is that out of an abundance of caution, the legal team determined that it would be appropriate to send out Rule 3.3 notices in relation to Dr. van der Riet's statement, albeit that he was not going to be presenting and giving evidence. We did so, and one of the implicated persons has responded to the Commission, and I'd like to take you through what is said in that response and to give you our approach. Chair, the response is from Mr. Mboweni. It is a response that was handed to me this morning, albeit that it was sent through on Friday. If I may beg leave just to hand it up.
Yes, thank you.
Chair, if you turn over to the second page, you really have the letter that was received by the Commission. What the letter makes clear is that the Rule 3.3 notice was received by Mr. Mboweni on the 15th of February. You'll see that in the first bullet of the page. And it was noticed that the evidence of Dr. van der Riet would be presented during the course of today's hearing, and so that is the date of the 26th of February that you see there. What the letter goes on to say is that despite the passage of time being 11 days, Mr. Mboweni has not been afforded the ordinary 14 days in which to make application, and he seeks a request, if you see over the page, that the date for the hearing be rescheduled and a fresh notice be submitted, which is received by Mr. Mboweni more than 14 clear days prior to the scheduled start for the hearing. Chair, if I may just make some submissions about the recommended approach of the legal team.
Yes.
There's no opportunity for Dr. van der Riet to be cross-examined quite clearly.
Yes.
If Mr. Mboweni would like to place his version before the Commission, whether by way of affidavit or oral evidence, he has every opportunity to do so, and we would certainly welcome him approaching the Commission on that basis. We therefore see no utility.
Did the notice from the Commission to him, was it appropriately amended to make sure that it didn't give the impression that Dr. van der Riet would be giving evidence?
Let me draw your attention to it.
Because most of those notices would be talking about people who will come and give evidence.
Yes,
so
indeed.
I wonder whether it was appropriately adjusted to indicate that this is not a witness who would be called.
Yes. Chair, let me find it for you. It is in file 5 before you.
Yes. I won't go to it, I'll just rely on you.
Indeed, I'm going to just get you the reference. Chair, unfortunately it appears that the form of the notice that went to one of the other implicated persons is in the file, but not the one that went to Mr. Mboweni. I would like to just check myself on that. Oh, sorry, 1, 2, and 5. Thank you, Chair. I'm indebted to my learned colleague. No, that's the one for Mr. Bester. No, the one for in relation to Dr. van der Riet has not been included. Over the break, I will confirm it for you,
fine.
Chair. But my recollection is that it made it clear that it was not the case that Dr. van der Riet would give evidence, but that his statement would be presented in evidence. I would just like to make absolutely sure about that. But it was known certainly at the time that Dr. van der Riet had passed away and would not be giving oral evidence. Indeed. And so, Chair, we can see no utility in delaying the presentation of Dr. van der Riet's statement today to fit it into the chronology of events, because Mr. Mboweni has every right to approach and put his version before this commission in due course.
Yes. But when do you intend introducing that statement?
During the course of Mr. Mashiko's evidence today at the appropriate point in the chronology.
Yes. Well, maybe what should happen is that one of your colleagues should just telephonically inform the attorneys that the position is that Dr. van der Riet is late, so it's not like he will be called to give evidence. His affidavit will be introduced, but if Mr. Mboweni wishes to file an affidavit to respond to the statement, he must do so in terms of the rules, and if he wishes to give evidence, he must just do what the rules require.
Indeed, Chair, we will do that. And just to make it clear, he was given a full copy of the affidavit and all its annexures as a supplement to the notice. So there will be nothing in addition to that will be covered today. Chair, the last, there are two further sources of the evidence in relation to Braakfontein. One of those sources is emails that have been recovered from the hard drive that, Chair, you received into evidence at the end of last year. To the best of our investigators' searches, these are emails that have not previously been publicly disclosed, and so they will form an important part of the puzzle. The final source of evidence will be a number of affidavits that will be presented at the relevant points in the evidence. They tend to be of an ancillary nature, Chair. They relate to computations of penalties and records of undersupply of coal. What we propose to do at the conclusion of the evidence, as my learned leader, Mr. Malek, has already signalled to you, Chair, is to invite you to, through the powers under Rule 310, ask for persons implicated as a consequence of the totality of the evidence to then provide answers in writing to this commission in relation to those aspects. And so we would ensure that any evidence that is pertinent, that is placed before this commission on affidavit, would be referenced in those Rule 310 notices that go to any persons implicated by them. But by and large, Chair, they tend to be of a statistical nature, and hence not the type of evidence that implicates people. There are one or two that do have implication, but I will address them when we get to it.
Okay.
Chair, those are the procedural matters. It then requires me to deal with the overview of the evidence so that it can be placed in its proper context and hopefully will be more accessible as a story that will then be presented through a series of witnesses. All that it purports to do is to highlight at the outset what the investigation has found and what evidence will be presented to the Chair.
No, that's fine. I wanted to say probably Mr. Mashiko might or should be qualified to tell me a little bit more about Acecom.
Indeed.
You know, we have Acecom being at the center of the investigations, the hearings, the next 2 weeks or so. And I don't want to rely simply on what I know as a member of the public about Eskom, there may be things that might be relevant that I should know. For example, I want to know how many divisions, what divisions does it have, what departments does Eskom have, which department does what, how do they relate to each other, to one another in relation to the core function of Eskom, the process of, these contracts relate to coal, coal, I think I don't know enough about those things, and it might just be important to have somebody from Eskom who tells me more about those things in order to enable me to appreciate certain nuances that might be relevant to the actual investigation. So if I suspect that he should be able to deal with all of those things.
Indeed.
So it might be useful to see if we can cover those things at the beginning.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Chair, we in fact anticipated that need. And what Mr. Mashiko has kindly done for us is produced a shortened version of a PowerPoint presentation that was prepared in 2015. It's been placed in the bundles, and my intention is to start with that.
Okay.
It will give you the background to Eskom, and importantly for Brakfontein, it will give you the background to coal supply and the role that it plays in powering power plants.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Chair, if I may then just commence with the overview.
Yes.
Chair, Brakfontein is the shorthand name for a coal mine in Delmas. It is a mine that was acquired at a point in time by Tegeta, and it was a mine that approached Eskom as early as 2011, but continuing through to 2014 to supply it with coal. Its endeavors to supply coal were initially rejected. We will go into why in the evidence. But towards the end of 2014, when it received a water use license on the 22nd of December 2014, the last ground on which the approaches could be refused was removed, and so a period of engagement with Tegeta for coal supply from Brakfontein began. Chair, the evidence will show that considerable pressure was placed on Eskom employees to conclude this agreement with Tegeta for coal supply from Brakfontein. They were told to finalize the agreement within 48 hours and to have it signed on the 10th of March 2015. That is when it was duly concluded, and it was to be a contract for coal supply for 10 years to the Majuba power plant for a total of 4.3 billion rand. The day after it was signed, Mr. Koko was suspended. You've heard evidence about that already. His suspension occurred on the 11th of March 2015. Chair, the evidence will show that the agreement was concluded despite a financial due diligence not having been completed. The financial due diligence was in fact completed at the end of April 2015, after the agreement was concluded and had become effective and coal supply had already commenced. That financial due diligence concluded that Tegeta was, quote, not financially sound enough to be awarded a contract of this value. Despite that, 2 months previously, it was awarded this contract for 4.3 billion. And despite that caution from finance at the end of April 2015, the contract continued to be implemented apace. It was implemented despite a critical condition precedent in the agreement not having been fulfilled. The condition precedent related to concerns that the technical arm of Eskom had about the quality of the coal that would come from the Brakfontein mine. We'll go into the details of why that quality is important through the evidence of Mr. Mashiko. But what's important for present purposes is that those who were pushed to conclude this agreement under great urgency tried to put in a protection for Eskom. The protection was that there would be a full, successful combustion test of the coal from Brakfontein by 4 p.m. on the 31st of March 2015. It's an unusual clause. I'll take the chair to it in the course of today's evidence, because it's not written in usual lawyer's language that just says it's a condition precedent and the agreement will fail if it's not performed. It goes on to say, and it will be the case that this agreement never came into existence. We will emphasize it because it's a key element of the protection that those who were in the know sought to place in the conclusion of the agreement. Despite that, no successful combustion test was done, and on the 7th of April, coal started to be delivered from the Brakfontein mine. The contract was also implemented for the better part of 2 years, despite another key element of the agreement not having been fulfilled, and that was the need for an automechanical sampler to do the sampling of the coal. Mr. Mashiko will also deal with why that mechanism to ensure objectivity and integrity of the process of sampling coal was so key in this contract and others. So despite that, the contract is implemented and there's no automechanical sampler. The next unusual event in the evidence that will be presented is that a matter of 3 months after the agreement became effective, there was an approach to Eskom to supply almost double the tonnage of coal that had originally been contracted for. That is the part of the evidence that is revealed in the emails that have been recovered and obtained from the hard drive. And what they show, akin to the evidence that was presented to the chair yesterday, is that there was a method of engagement between Tegeta and Eskom at that time, June 2015, where Tegeta would dictate the terms on which it wanted Eskom to respond to its offers. There's the rewriting of the letters that Eskom ultimately provides to Tegeta. The next thing that happens in the performance of the contract, as will be revealed in the evidence, is that the quality of the coal from Brakfontein starts to become an issue. It gets increasingly bad in July of 2015 and reaches a fever pitch in August of 2015. At that point, the existing laboratory, nominated and accredited laboratory of Eskom's, an independent one called Sibonesiwe, had failed 15 out of 30 samples that had been obtained from the Brakfontein mine. But there was suddenly an allegation from Brakfontein mine that a bribe had been sought to be solicited from them by Sibonesiwe Labs. So a decision was taken to move the lab to the SABC lab, another accredited lab, independent, that Eskom uses in order to do a reanalysis of that sample which Sibonesiwe had failed 15 out of the 30 of. When that happened, SABC failed 29 out of the 30 of the reanalyzed samples. This had become such a serious matter that Dr. van der Riet and a team of 3 others were appointed to deal with the matter. They were reporting directly to Mr. Koko and involved in meetings with Ms. Daniels about the issue of coal quality supply from Brakfontein. They took it seriously, they started investigating, and a decision was taken that on Saturday the 29th of August, Dr. van der Riet and his team would go to Brakfontein and they would witness the sampling of a new set of coal to be sent for new analysis. Dr. van der Riet was called, however, in advance of the Saturday by Mr. Koko and he was told not to attend, that the sampling would take place without any Eskom personnel present. Dr. van der Riet conveyed to Mr. Koko that that would be irregular. It would not be in accordance with the contracted quality management processes, but despite that, the sampling went ahead. Chair, that sample was then analysed in what can only be described as mysterious circumstances. We will go into the detail of that in the evidence, but it passed. It passed resoundingly and was deemed to be within the quality specifications of the coal supply agreement. Dr. van der Riet says that on its own, in his statement, should have been a cause for caution, because until then, they were failing. And now all of a sudden, when a sample was taken at which no Eskom personnel were present, it suddenly passes. But he starts to put his full report together so that he can report the following week to Mr. Koko and the rest of the team about what the analysis was showing. But unfortunately, he was unable to do so, because on Tuesday, the 1st of September, he was summarily suspended, together with his 3 colleagues, who were at that stage involved in assisting him to get to the bottom of the coal quality issues in relation to the Brakfontein coal. Chair, he was suspended for 32 months. So for the better part of 3 years, Eskom lost the services of Dr. van der Riet. He was ultimately exonerated of all charges against him, and his statement goes into some detail about the efforts he made to speed up that disciplinary process, but to no avail.
I seem to have read something either in his statement or elsewhere which gave me the impression that Eskom may have actually asked him to come back from suspension earlier, but he insisted that there should be a process in terms of which he would be cleared or something like that.
Indeed, Chair. What it shows is that there was eventually a disciplinary process. The chairperson exonerated him of all charges but one. There was a further charge that was added late in the day that related to him having sent to himself 27 emails related to the Brakfontein affair on the morning of his suspension from his Eskom email account to his private email account. And the chairperson of the disciplinary inquiry found that he was guilty of that charge. Eskom, however, reviewed that and regarded it as having been irrationally arrived at and then invited him back. And that was on the 1st of May 2018. So he re-entered the employ of Eskom at the beginning of May last year, after being unavailable to it for 32 months to provide his expertise. When we get to Dr. van der Riet's statement, what we will be making clear is the key role that coal quality plays and can potentially affect the load shedding crisis that Eskom has experienced regularly. And so the loss of those services we will submit had a serious impact on Eskom over the period. Chair, we then jump in the evidence to August 2016. So just to recap, it's about September 2015 when Dr. van der Riet and his team are suspended. And then the contract continues to be performed, but by about August 2016, undersupply from the Brakfontein mine starts in some significant proportion. But in that very same month...
So first there was an agreement that Brakfontein would supply an agreed amount of
Indeed.
coal. Then they made an approach to Eskom to say, we actually want to supply you more.
Yes.
And then later on, they couldn't supply even the agreed one.
Correct.
Okay.
Indeed, Chair. And when the undersupply starts, Eskom approaches National Treasury to give Tegeta another 2.9 billion rand. They do so because Earlier in 2016, there was a National Treasury instruction to all Schedule 2 public entities that if they sought to vary an existing contract by more than 15%, they would have to obtain the approval of Treasury. So, but for that instruction, it would have been entirely within Eskom's domain to decide to increase the contract. But, as luck would have it, for want of a better description, because of this instruction in April 2016, Eskom had to apply to Treasury for approval. So it applied to Treasury for approval to give Tegeta 2.9 billion rand more for 10.8 million tons more of coal over the course of the agreement. But it did so on terms that are patently misrepresenting the facts. Chair, what the evidence will show is that representations were made to Treasury about the quality of the coal that had been confirmed, when in fact it had not been confirmed. Let me just go back a moment to explain what I mean by that. The coal supply agreement covered two properties which comprise the Brakfontein mine. There's what's called the Brakfontein Colliery, and then there's a second property adjacent to it, in fact separated, I'm told, and this will come out in the evidence, by the road, the R35 through Delmas. On the other side of the road is what's called the Brakfontein Colliery Extension. Tegeta had mining rights in respect of both, and when the approach is made to National Treasury in 2016, it is said that the colliery extension has now come online and coal will be supplied from there, and it's been confirmed as being of the right quality. Well, as a matter of fact, it had not been confirmed as the right quality. In fact, the tests available at the time had said it was not suitable and that more holes had to be drilled to take further samples. National Treasury did not give the approval. It didn't give the approval because it had got wind of the quality issues, and it said until the quality of the coal matter had been resolved, it was not going to approve the extension. A further attempt was made in January 2017 to get National Treasury approval, but it was never granted. And so that attempt at the extension of the agreement never came to fruition. Chair, Tegeta continued to supply, albeit under the original agreement, but in dwindling amounts from that late 2016 period. There were some months where there was more, other months when there were less, but by about November 2017, the undersupply situation had become very serious. They were notified under the contract that they had to come up with a rectification plan because the undersupply was of a significant magnitude, and if they failed to do so, penalties would be applied. Well, in February 2018, Tegeta went into business rescue, could no longer supply coal. It hasn't done so since February 2018, and every month penalties have been levied against it to what is now the total of 500 million. So that will be the Brakfontein story, Chair. That is the overview. And at the relevant point in the evidence, in order to be of assistance, we will go back to the chronology and just locate ourselves as to where we are in the story.
Yes.
Chair, that is the overview. If I may then call for Mr. Mashiko to come forward.
Yes, do so. Thank you.
If I may request that he be sworn in.
Dan Mashiko. Do you have any objections of taking the prescribed affirmation?
No.
Do you solemnly affirm that the evidence you will give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please raise your right hand and say, I truly affirm.
I truly affirm.
Thank you. Yes, you may proceed, Ms.
Thank you,
Hoffman.
Chair. Mr. Mashiko, if I can just orientate you, you have a set of files on your left-hand side. They are identified as files 3, 4, and 5 on the spine. Chair, the files have already been identified as U4 in the sequence of the bundles of the evidence for Acecom. If I may just request that that be entered into the record.
So they are part of Exhibit U.
They are part of Exhibit U, and they are the fourth part. So they have been identified as U4.
Oh, okay. And then so there is file 3 of Exhibit U4 and file 4 of Exhibit U4 and file 5 of Exhibit U4, is that right?
Indeed, Chair.
Okay, the files have already been marked U4. They are part of Exhibit U4, so there'll be file 3, file 4, and file 5, all under Exhibit U4.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah.
And those will be the only files that will be relevant for the Brackfontein evidence.
Thank you.
Mr. Mashiko, if I could ask you to take out file 3. And if you go to, just to orientate you, the files have a pagination in the top right-hand corner of each page. They are Bruck, as shorthand for Brackfontein, and then a number. If you go to Bruck 128.
I'm sorry, before you proceed, this might be something that needs to be attended to in regard to a number of lever arch files.
Yes.
You'll find that what you have in the spine is volume U4. We should have exhibit U4 somewhere so that anybody who is looking for exhibit U4 doesn't see volume U4 and says
Indeed.
this is not the right one.
Indeed.
Yeah, okay.
Chair, if we can do that over the tea break for
That's
your
fine.
files, and
That's
we'll
fine,
make sure
yeah.
to do the same with ours.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mashiko, if you go to Bruck 128, you will see the first page of a statement, and that statement runs to page 160, as I have it. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Can you confirm that that is your statement?
I'm sorry, I missed which one you are at.
Sorry, Chair, we're in file 3,
Yeah.
and it begins at Bruck 128.
Yes, I've got it. Thank you.
That is the first page of the statement, and it runs to page 160. Mr. Mashiko, can you confirm that that is your statement?
It is indeed my statement.
And you confirm that its contents are true and correct?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Mr. Mashiko, I will take you to parts of your statement in the course of your evidence, but there is also a great deal of additional information that the investigators have compiled subsequent to receiving your statement, and so I will also ask you to go to those aspects which are generally found in file 4 during the course of your evidence at relevant points. If I may then...
What page does his statement end?
It ends at page... The statement itself, Chair, ends at page 160, but then it is followed by numerous annexures that commence from page 161 and run for the remainder of file 3.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I think the reason why I couldn't see was I was looking for his signature.
Yes, indeed. It's not signed, which is why I requested him to confirm its contents under oath here. Thank you, Chair. Mr. Mashiko, if we may just start with some background then. What is the current position that you occupy at Acecom?
I'm the acting head of primary energy, or acting senior general manager in primary energy, which is part of the generation division.
We'll get into the sort of organogram structure of Acecom in a moment, but if I may just ask you about your qualifications. What qualifications do you have?
I'm a technologist, diplomate chemist. I'm a chemist by trade.
Thank you. And how long have you been employed at Acecom?
I'm 25 years in Acecom. This is my 26th year. End of June, I'll be 26 years in Acecom.
And Mr. Mashiko, you've told us the position you currently occupy at Acecom. Can you describe for the Chair the position you occupied in 2015 when the coal supply agreement with Braakfontein was concluded?
In 2015, I was the acting general manager for coal operations, which is a function that basically executes the contract and the supply to various stations.
Just as a matter of interest, you said you are on your 26th year.
Yes.
At Acecom. Was Acecom your first employer after university, or when
The
you
only
started?
employer, Chair.
The only employer?
Yes, Chair.
You don't know any other employer?
No, not at all.
Okay, all right.
We thought as a result he'd be the right witness to give you the Acecom inside track.
He definitely should be, yeah.
Thank you, Chair. If you can go, Mr. Mashiko, to file 3, and the first page of that file after the green file divider. You'll see that that has a slightly different numbering. It begins at BRUC U4A.1, and it is a printed version of a PowerPoint presentation that runs to page 26. Can you confirm that you provided the Commission with this PowerPoint presentation?
That starts where?
At BRUC U4A.1 in file 3.
BRUC U41.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, Chair.
It might be necessary also during the break to put, I don't know whether it will be dividers, but something that will know where I find his statement, so, and other important documents that you will be referring to frequently.
We can do that.
Not necessarily every document, but those that you think you'll be referring to frequently.
We'll do that, Chair,
Yeah.
with pleasure.
Okay.
Mr. Mashiko, if you turn past the first page of that PowerPoint presentation to page 2, you'll see there that the slide is headed PED Mandate and Structure. Can you please tell the Chair what PED stands for?
Okay, it's an acronym for Primary Energy Division.
And can you tell us what the structure displays on page 2 about the organogram of that division within Acecom?
Firstly, I must just qualify that this was the structure in 2015, the timing point of interest. So at that point, primary energy was part of group technology and commercial, and it had numerous functions, which is fuel sourcing, which this is a team that basically identifies sources and conclude coal supply agreement, and thereafter hand over the coal supply agreements to a function called coal supply operations. The functions are segregated. I think it's good governance to segregate roles. The person that concludes the contract can't be the implementer of the contract. So that's how it was, divided on coal. And following that, because our coal is delivered through 3 modes, it's conveyor for mines that are adjacent to the power stations, followed by rail for mines that are distant from the power stations, and the last mode of delivery is road transportation. So we've got a specific function that manages other logistics other than rail, because it's quite a significant volume that we are transporting on rail and road and rail. It's more than 40 million tons.
The ones that are close, that are adjacent to Acecom, how close are they? A matter of a few kilometers or what?
Yeah, Chair, they vary, but it's quite near. It's I think the
Within a
longest distance
radius
will be
of-
about 7 kilometers. So
Oh,
basically, the power
okay.
station sits at the mouth of the mine.
Okay,
Yes.
okay. And then those that are taken to be far enough so that you use rail would be about how far away, more or less?
Some of the furthest will be about 200 kilometers.
Oh,
However, the traveling distance may be slightly more. So the resultant distance may be 200 kilometers.
Yes.
The traveling distance, would be more. So they vary.
Yes.
Yeah, they vary.
Oh, okay. And then the road, would those be the furthest?
Similar
farthest?
road will be in the range, anything between 10 kilometers to 200 kilometers.
Oh, closer.
Depending on the matching of the qualities
Yes.
to a particular power station. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And then that is, I take it, the block represented by logistics on the page. Is that correct?
Certainly.
And
And
then-
those first three blocks deal with, a coal sourcing, coal supply, including the delivery of coal at the power station, whereby, the coal is consumed, by the power station. Then there are further, functions in the whole division. Primary energy is also responsible for sourcing water for all the coal-fired power stations. So that is one element. It's water and environment. It's separate. It's not coal. We source quite a lot of water to keep the power station going. Then we've got an integrated planning function, which is a function that takes the production plan from the fleet part of generation and breaks it down into the coal demand for each power station. Then we match the coal demand with what is currently contracted, and whether we have a shortfall or we have an excess. Where there is a shortfall, then the trigger goes into the sourcing team now to fill up, the shortfall. It's an iterative process that happens on a short-term, medium-term, and long-term basis, but it's done continuously. Chair.
So which section does that?
It's integrated planning. Chair, maybe if I
Yes.
may take from a macro perspective, you would have the resource plan in the country, commonly known as the integrated resource plan, which basically stipulates, what energy, a demand, the country should be able
Yeah.
to meet,
Yeah.
and allocates who's supposed to, produce. And Eskom has its own allocation with its own fleet. A lot of it is existent, bar the two, large power stations that are still under construction. And the same IRP is the one that basically does a determination on the renewables and any other interested licensee that would like to play in the power generation space. Once that IRP is completed, within Eskom, we take, that resource plan and we break it down in terms of, the energy wheel diagram. Based on that energy wheel diagram, you then start filling the gaps for the demand with Eskom fleet and also, the other supplies. We do get plus minus, I think, 8,058 megawatts that coming across from Mozambique Hydro, Karaura Basa. And you also have your IPPs and you have Eskom. So in a total nutshell, the capacity that is controlled within the Eskom, a power system, it's about 50,000 megawatts. If I include Eskom own generation, the IPPs, and the hydro Karaura Basa. Then that energy gets broken down into Eskom, for different modes of power generation. We've got about 26 power stations, in Eskom, ranging from coal, which is the biggest, a part of the fleet, it's about 82%. Then there is a certain amount of power.
82.
It's about 82%.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And then there is a coal allocation, or coal production, allocation. And based on that coal production, this is basically saying coal power stations should generate a certain amount of power over a period of time, and then we break it into a budget year, which is 1 year, our corporate plan, which is 5 years, and then the long-term range, basically, which is 10 and, beyond, going to the period of the integrated resource plan. We break down the coal, power demand and allocate per individual power stations based on the power stations matrix on what is their planned capacity, what is their unplanned capacity, what is the schedule of interventions. That basically states how much coal will be required for the entire total coal fleet and per particular power station. We then go further to match the coal demand to ensure that we can produce that volume of energy and compare against what is currently existing and contracted. And that basically will say to us, we've got adequate coal to supply in a particular year or a period of time. And if not, there will be a shortfall, and that shortfall will trigger the process to go and source additional coal to ensure that at any given point in time, we are able to match, like the demand and serve power, and keep a certain, like a stock holding as a buffer in a power station for operational, variations and so on. That's in a nutshell how we get to an individual power station and going out and say, I need X amount of coal for this particular power station and a particular quality criteria.
Yes.
So that is a function that is done by integrated planning on an iterative and continuous basis.
Okay.
Yeah. Then we go further. We have another function that does what we call assurance. And in the overview statement that was given, there is a technical services function which looks purely at assurance on the coal contract. This is basically quality assurance and also pre-contracting assurance. This is a team of technical experts. We have mining engineers, we've got geologists, and we've got metallurgists. We've got quality assurance people. So prior contracting, they will evaluate the resource, or the reserve that will be offered by a particular supplier, whether it meets the quality criteria. That includes going to the sites, verifying the mine does exist indeed. They verify the capacity of the mine that it will be able to match the required coal that they are putting on a bid. They also verify the practicality and ability of that mine to meet the quality criteria. They will look at the borehole data that the mine has done, review the borehole data to match the quality, the processing of the plant up until, the gate of the mine to say this is the amount of coal that can be supplied and so on. So that's what the team does. So they do work prior to contracting and they do work during contracting. And this is a team that basically oversees the day-to-day quality assurance when the coal is produced by a mine. We've got various aspects of how we do quality determination for coal that is delivered by conveyor and coal that is delivered, by road and rail. The coal that is delivered by road and rail, we pre-certify before it is dispatched. And that is done because we have more than 40 coal supply agreements that are running basically on road and rail, bar the 9 that is conveyor.
Yes.
So it's quite a very, a complex environment, multiple suppliers, multiple modes of transportation. At any given point in time, we've got more than 2,000 coal trucks that are basically moving the Acecom coal consignment. So we pre-certify a stockpile at a given point in time, and when it matches the contracted quality criteria, then it will be given a go-ahead to be loaded onto a train or onto a truck, then dispatched to a particular power station. So this is the team that does it, yeah.
So the pre-certification, I think is that what you call it?
Yes, that's what you call it. Yeah.
So the certification would be done at the mine or at the supplier's premises or wherever.
Yes, Chair.
That's where it would be done, but it's done by the Acecom team from this department.
Yeah. Because the mining operation is under the custodianship of the mine, there is regulations that governs it. The mine is responsible to ensure that the sample is taken within the ISO standards that are stipulated in the contract, and that sample is provided. Acecom nominated sample transporters will take that sample, register it accordingly, and take it to a nominated lab, which is contracted by Acecom.
Yes.
And then the quality determination will be done, yeah.
Oh,
but the quality determination is under Acecom's control.
Oh, okay.
So the labs that do those analyses are Acecom appointed. Yeah.
So it might not be the Acecom team from this department, but it's people who have been approved by Acecom at that particular lab.
Certainly, through a commercial contractual agreement.
Okay.
Certainly,
Okay.
So
and then in that event, when the coal is actually delivered to Acecom, this department still goes through to check if the coal meets those standards, or not really when it's
not as a norm, Chair, because you do pre-certification. It's like you purchasing any other commodity where you get a green sticker that says this commodity has met the certain quality criteria.
Yeah.
However, we do time and again random verification. Certainly, we also do have a regiment to check how the quality analysis is done at those various labs, because they are ISO accredited.
Yes.
We are not accreditors. However, we understand the ISO process. We send our own technical expert to go and witness as they do the analysis that they do it, correctly, including the sampling at the mine. So we have oversight, of that as part of the controls. Yeah.
So there are a number of these labs that do this, on which Acecom relies.
I think at this point we've got about 5. So it's not like a multitude of them. They analyze a lot of samples.
Yes.
However, there's about 5. I think we've got about 5 contracted labs that basically are placed around Mpumalanga.
Yes.
Most of these mines are in Mpumalanga.
But the samples that they analyze relate to those suppliers who use rail or road to transport.
Definitely, Chair, yeah.
Okay.
The coal, maybe to close off completely, the coal that is transported by conveyor, it goes through an automechanical sampler which is located on an Acecom site.
Yes.
And that particular sample gets divided between the power station lab and the mine lab. So that is treated differently. Hence I'm saying the way we do for the conveyor coal and how we deal with the road and rail delivered, it's slightly different. But the parameters are exactly the same, the tests are the same and so on.
Yes, no, thank you.
So, Chair, that wraps up basically what the technical services function, does. And then we've got other, a support function, business integration, performance management, and operational risk and safety. The transportation of coal on road has introduced the dynamic in terms of the interface with public, are we operating safely? And hence we have, this particular function. That's basically the value chain on how, from the point of sourcing coal, delivering coal, and doing payments and so on. It sits in basically one function, Chair. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mashiko. Could I just ask a few questions in relation to the slide with reference to Brakfontein itself? You've explained to the Chair that there are some mines that are located adjacent to power stations and others that are located further away. What is Brakfontein?
Brakfontein is very remote to Majuba Power Station. It's in the Delmas, a precinct in Mpumalanga, and Majuba Power Station, which is basically the host power station. It's very close to Amersfoort, much closer to the northern Natal. So it's quite a distance. It's more than 100. I think it's the traveling distance by road is probably close to 200, and by rail more or less between 180 and 200. So it's quite a distance. So it is one of those that we do the pre-certification, quality determination.
Okay. And then just in terms of the various power stations, you also indicated to the Chair that there will be those power stations because of their locality adjacent to a mine who receive coal from that mine, but there are other power stations given their locality that will receive coal from a number of mines. Can you just clarify for the Chair what position Majuba is in?
Yeah. Majuba does not have a tight colliery. It's got a history from construction. It had a mine, but major geological issues. It's a very difficult mine. It was closed around 1996. And since then, coal has been sourced, far from Majuba, from around the Wochi Sweetbank coal field. So Majuba has multiple coal suppliers. Its burn per annum ranges between 12 and 14, but at nominal, a capacity, Majuba would require about 14 million tons, to make sure that it can provide power. At a given point in time, Majuba, would have on average about 10 different coal supply agreement or coal suppliers that are supplying, the power station. So it's not only one power station. And Brakfontein, I think, accounted for about 15% of the total Majuba, coal consumption on a given financial year.
Is that opposite in 2015?
In 2015, it was more or less about 15, yeah.
And just back to 2015, in terms of those mines that were supplying Majuba, where would Brakfontein have ranged in terms of its distance from the power plant?
It ranged among the furthest. I think there's 2 other mines that are in the Delmas area that supply, but yeah, the Brakfontein is among the furthest, from Majuba Power Station. So logistics is quite it's quite a sizable part, of the coal supply from Brakfontein to Majuba, and it is on road because Brakfontein does not have a rail siding.
Thank you. If we can then move in your PowerPoint to the next page, which is page 3. You've dealt there already in some detail with coal supply and coal logistics. Is there any aspect of that slide that you'd like to draw to the Chair's attention?
No, not really. I think we've covered basically even the amount of coal that we are moving on road and rail. Road takes the bigger portions, about 43. Rail, on average, say 12 million tons, per annum.
And the position with Brakfontein, did they transport by road or by rail?
It's predominantly by road. There are sidings or rail sidings in the vicinity of where Brakfontein is. And when we have capacity, we do move some of the coal from the mine to the rail siding, and then we load it on rail to Majuba. So it's multimodal, but predominantly it's on road.
And which is the more expensive method of transport, road or rail?
It is road.
And who picks up those transportation costs in relation to the coal supply agreements?
It's Acecom, it's part of the delivered cost.
If you then move to slide 4 and 5, if you can just take the Chair through what those reflect.
Those slides.
I'm sorry, are you still at 3? Are you still at page 3, Mr.
Yes.
Kaufman? Oh, okay, all right, yes.
So 3, Mr. Mashiko indicated he'd already covered in his broader explanation to you of the origins of the coal supply and the logistics aspects.
Yes.
And so maybe we can move to slide 4.
Well, Mr. Mashiko, you deal with these things all the time, and you are very experienced in them, so you'll forgive some of the questions that might show how little one knows about some of these things. You have on page 3, the first column, under coal supply, coal manages the supply of 120. Is that what, megatons or what is that?
It's million tons, Chair. Million tons, 120 million
Oh,
tons.
million tons.
Yes, Chair.
Oh, okay, of coal per annum. That would come from one mine or where?
No, this is a total portfolio, Chair.
Oh,
so
okay.
this is now the mines that are adjacent, the mines that are further.
All the suppliers.
It is a total coal,
Okay.
that we basically manage the supply per annum.
Okay. No. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. And then if we move over to slide 4, that just gives you a snapshot.
Chair, the slide 4 and 5, I'll deal that in basically one breath. It's a statistical, a demonstration of how much, coal South Africa as a continent, as South Africa consume relative to the total, a continent. So it's about 92%, of all coal consumed in the country is basically consumed in South Africa. And if you go further,
92% consumed in the continent is consumed in the country, in this country.
Yes. And if you go further, basically now coming closer to home, the Acecom part, of that 92%, and if you're looking basically in the sovereign, that
Yes.
Acecom consumes, 50%, of the total coal that is currently produced in the country.
Yes, okay.
So the country, on average, produces about 250 million tons. So our portion is about 120. We've got about 75 million tons that is export via Richards Bay. Then you have the domestic consumers like Sasol, which is about 40 million tons. Then you've got other domestic consumers, about 28, million tons. But we account for about 50%. So we're the single largest user,
Yes.
of coal, in the country.
And just to be
Thank
clear
you.
again, these are statistics relevant in 2015.
Absolutely, Chair.
Thank you. We can then skip over slide 6 because that's just an introductory slide. What follows, though, in the successive slides is some background as to coal geology. And if you would take the Chair through that aspect, please.
Chair, this is not trying to make you a geologist. It's just giving a snapshot that, coal is a carbonaceous material that has been formed over multiple hundreds of, millions of years. That is almost 300 million years, ago. from carbonaceous material, that is flora and fauna, and whereby, climate, like at that point in time have, like an impact on the coal, like a production. The type of plant composition, will determine the higher carbon content. Basically means you will end up with, like a higher, like a coal deposit.
It affects the quality.
The quality and quantity, because in there you got, blending with other, like a inorganic material, which is called rock, soil, and so on. And then the sedimentary environment with rains, washing, with other, earth movements like, volcanoes and so on, they do affect, basically the formation of the coal, or they affected the formation of the coal over the 300, million years, and the depth at which the coal, is found. The deeper the coal, the older the coal, or the pit that formed the coal, and the higher, the quality of coal. So when we count the typical seam, like in Mpumalanga, you count from seam 1 up to seam 5. So your seam 1, seam 2 typically are your high, like a quality coal that are in situ, to a point that some of the older, like 1 and 2 seam, you did not need to wash or beneficiate, you could actually export as is. But the higher you go, in terms of height and also the ranking, the lower the quality. So 5 seam will typically, 4 and 5 seam will typically, be your, your lower quality seams. And in between these coal seams, Chair, and as demonstrated in some of the slides better, there is what we call interseam, a sediment, that are, or overburden as we call it. So you get your topsoil, what we all see, but to get to your first coal seam, which is typically depending on where, the location of the resources, you typically encounter seam 5, but seam 5 is not available throughout all the coal fields. Typically you'll find seam 4. Then as you mine deeper, you go through an interburden, between seam 4 and seam 2, and you're lucky you may get, a 1 seam, but some of the coal deposit you only find 4 seams, some you find 2 seam, 4 seam, and 5 seam, so they do vary because of what happened, over a period of time, and when the continents also, segregated and so on. So,
Mr. Mashiko?
So the deeper you dig, the greater the chances that you'll get better quality.
Inherently, Chair, yes.
Yeah.
Inherently.
Okay.
Mr. Mashiko, if I could ask you to go to slide 10, just in the context of this explanation about coal seams, because you have some diagrams there that may assist in describing the seams. If you could take the Chair through what that slide reflects.
Chair, as I mentioned, it's a function of time. The coal formation is also a function of time. I've mentioned climate, what happened with the movement, but it's also a function of time. So moving from left to right on that slide, it is where you still have, a flora and fauna, existing, and then you have, those environmental factors that form coal up until today, where you have, various segregations, of the coal seam. So the black borders that you see in there, they represent a coal seam. So you can see there is overburden, that is surface. Then you come across, the first seam. Typically it will be 5 seam. There's interburden. Then the next seam, if you're going down, is 4 seam. Then you get further, an interburden. Then you can see closer down is 2 seam. Then the fine small one right at the end is where you are lucky, is 1 seam.
Is a seam like a layer from that part of underground to that part? It's 1 seam. Is that what it is?
Certainly, Chair. If I look at that wall, it may represent a seam.
A seam, okay.
And then the ground we're standing on may be interburden to the next seam.
Yeah.
And the roof is basically
another
interburden
seam.
to the.
Okay.
Yeah, you spot on, Chair. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Is there a particular size that is used to say this is 1 seam, or how do you differentiate from 1 seam to another? Like it should be so many kilometers down or underground, or what?
No, it is not a function of, you and I determining that. It's a function of what nature has left there, and basically how it is formed over a period of years. As I mentioned, counting to the lowest, like a seam. The heights of the seams and the interburden, it's a function, basically
Yeah.
of nature. Yeah. So we don't.
So it depends what you find
It depends what you
in
a particular coal
in a
deposit.
yes. Then you know that if you find APC, then it must be a seam.
And where you find it
And
also,
where you find it,
geologically
yeah.
it will tell you now you've encountered 4 seam, you've encountered.
Oh.
So it is known from geological, like a modeling.
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
it is a known, yeah.
Thank you.
And just to clarify again in relation to quality, is it correct that your evidence to the chair indicated that the lower in number the seam, the higher the quality of the coal? Is that accurate?
Inherently so, Chair. You'll find that 2 seam inherently is of a higher quality compared to 4 seam.
On a lighter note, so this would be what, Geology 101?
Chair, we,
Geologists will be
Or
upset
not
with
even,
you and I.
or not even Geology 101?
Hopefully I've done a good job in taking what they do to represent it.
You are doing a good job, Mr. Mashiko.
Mr. Mashiko, before we leave the seams, can you just explain to the chair the difference between an upper and a lower seam in any particular number?
So, Chair, if you look at the last, like a representation, graphic representation, in that 4 seam, you can have the quality varying in one band of seam. And that's basically, like a 4 seam typically, is that, the lowest in terms of depth will typically be, like a 4 seam lower. It will be higher in quality. And then the upper part of that particular seam will be typically 4 seam upper, and it tends to be much more or a bit inferior compared, to the 4 seam lower. And I think Braakfontein is one of those mines that basically you've got this, like a delineation of the two seams, and that is important because you have to decide as a miner whether you mine it, totally, and are you going to treat it, or you mine selectively to meet certain, like a quality requirement. And Braakfontein, based on the geological study that was done, the drilling, the core drilling, it found that the 4 seam upper quality were not like of the quality that you can use as is. You either had to beneficiate through a washing plant and so on. The 4 seam lower, however, did meet the Majuba requirements, and hence we could specify in what proportions, the coal should be produced to make sure that you meet the quality criteria continuously.
Okay.
Sorry, Chair. What I'd like to move to next is the activities on the mine for how the coal is removed from underground, and then how it gets to the power station, and why quality of coal at the power station is such an important issue. But we are at the tea break, if you'd like to take that adjournment now.
Okay, let's take the short adjournment. We will resume at 11:30. The commission adjourns.
All right.
Yes, you may proceed, Ms. Hoffman.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Mashiko, you'd taken us through some of the, I think we call it Geology 101. If we can now move to slide 13, because what I'd now like to deal with is coal mining itself. And this is a slide which gives us some insight into that. If you would please take the chair through what the slide depicts.
Thanks. So basically what you see in front of you is just a graphic representation of how coal is extracted, like in South Africa. Two methods, underground and open cast. And the decision making around whether you go underground or open cast, it's the depth, of the coal seam you are going to mine. The shallower the coal, you basically use open cast mining method. When the coal is deeper, you basically would sink a shaft and go directly to where the coal seam is, and then you mine using...
Mr. Mashiko, sorry to interrupt. I just want to ensure that the chair is... we were at slide 13, Chair. Have you got that?
I got that,
Super.
but when you are at Geology 101, when you are at first year, you have got to make sure you understand things properly. I saw, Mr. Mashiko, when you told us about seams at BRAC 410, the seams there were spelled SEAMS. Now I see now at BRAC 413, there is access deep seams with WE. Is that something different, or is there spelling error?
It's a typo, Chair. It's a typo.
It should be EA.
EA.
Oh, okay, all right.
Okay. Chair, so we look from top down. The top part represents basically surface. And on you can see there's a dotted line that cuts, that picture almost
in the
into
middle.
half. Yeah. And that line represents the decision making once you've identified the ore body, how you're going to mine the coal. Cost of mining is quite it's a significant, a decision making aspect, so
yes.
Once the geologists have identified, where the coal is and so on, the mine planners would then come up with plans how to access the coal and what is the best mining method to extract that coal economically.
Yes.
And as I've mentioned, if you move from surface to where the coal is, if the coal is closer to the surface that is shallower, open cast mechanism is used.
Yes.
And open cast because you have to remove the entire overburden and topsoil to get to the coal seam.
Yes.
And the depth of your topsoil and overburden to get to your first coal seam relative, to the coal seam itself is what people talk about strip ratio. So the more overburden that you have to move to get to the coal, you would have a high ratio which says, it's going to be costly. The lower the ratio, if you say, 3:1, then you know that you basically have a very good economic model. If the coal is too deep, then you go into, underground, mining.
Yes.
Underground mining, you basically would sink a shaft. So that white, that structure,
line.
Yeah, it symbolizes, a shaft basically going to the different seam. You can see the top seam, which is 4 seam, and then you go further down to get to 2 seam. That's basically what that represents and so on.
Okay.
So you basically, you don't remove any overburden topsoil. You go straight, to the coal seam, and then the mechanized mining basically would continue horizontally. So you go vertically down, you get to the coal seam, and then you mine, horizontally and so on. So, and then open cast basically, as it's represented there, you can see that, a structure, that is on top of the purple, coloring. That's what we call a drag line. It's a high volume mover, of your overburden and topsoil. And once the coal seam is exposed, it gets blasted, and then it gets loaded onto the trucks to go to crushers and beneficiation and to the power station. That's basically, the 2 separate process. So open cast is total extraction. You extract the entire, a coal seam. Underground is quite selective. and you leave some of the coal behind in a form of support structures, what we call pillars.
Yes.
Because you have to have, like a stability underground for people to be able to work, safely. And leaving those pillars behind basically says your extraction rate is much lower.
Okay.
50 to 60%, whereas open cast is, it's 100%, like extraction and so on. Yeah. That's what that picture basically symbolizes, how you get to the coal and so on. And Braakfontein, the mine in question, is on the right-hand side. It's an open cast, like a mining operation.
Oh, okay. In open cast, you could be. So you don't go underground. You do go underground, but only in a limited way.
No, you don't go underground. It's surface. You're always exposed to the weather elements. And they coin it sunshine mining because you always see the sun.
So you actually literally don't go underground at all.
No. You access from the top and you expose totally to the elements.
But are there many, suppliers like that for Acecom?
I think open cast mining is a bigger portion of our coal mining. There's virtually very few underground mines operating. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And it's not only in coal mining. I mean, if you go like to the northwest, you'll see a lot of other, open cast mining for other type of, ore body or quarries. In and around Gauteng, you see quarries. That's an open cast mine where they, mine, aggregates for construction and other things. It's an open cast mine chair, basically. Yeah.
Well, for some of us, the moment you talk about mining, we're thinking about going underground all the time.
It's when the ore body is very deep down. The most economic way is to sink a shaft.
Yes.
You go down like gold mining, platinum, your hard rock type mining. Deeper gold mines close to 4 kilometers from surface, underground. It's because it's uneconomic to can remove 4 kilometers of overburden to get, to the gold reef.
Yes. No, thank you.
Mr. Mashiko, if we could just stay on 13 for a moment. So I just wanted to clarify the representation of the seams on that diagram. Just to clarify in relation to your evidence earlier, those black horizontal lines reflect the seams. Is that correct?
That's correct, ma'am.
And we start at the bottom with what I think is number 2 seam. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then moving up, number 4 seam, and then above that, number 5 seam. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So in the open cast section that's represented here, what seam is the mining occurring at?
You can see the purple where the drag line stands, or representation of a drag line. You can see they don't have 5 seam there. The first coal seam is a much thicker one, which is 4 seam. So they are mining, like a 4 seam.
And back to the question I raised earlier with between upper and lower seams, would that black line then be divided in a proportion to show an upper and a lower seam?
Yeah, not physically, for you to see. It will be based on the geological sample that has been taken. When it gets analyzed, they can see the different qualities on the all the seam band. Yeah.
Can you talk about seams in relation to open cast mining? In other words, is the concept of seams only applicable to underground mining, or is it applicable to both open cast and underground?
It's a constant. The coal seam is there. The type of mining, it's basically based on how deep that particular seam is. Yeah, okay. And as I mentioned, if and as you can see, what we try to demonstrate with this diagram, with a dotted line that goes across, it shows you that anything beyond on average 40 meters, you start considering underground and not for seam. So it is the depth of the seam that decides whether you're gonna extract using open cast or underground. The shallower, the coal can be found is open cast, and then the deeper it's underground. Yeah.
Okay.
If we then move over to slide 14, this gives a bit more detail as to the open cast process flow. If you'll take the chair through that, please.
So you can see it starts from the first picture. If you go counterclockwise, that's where the drilling and blasting of your overburden. So the topsoil, would be removed, much more easier, and then the overburden has to be, blasted. So they will be drilling, they put in a charge, they blast, and then they start removing the topsoil. And then the removal is done by, if it's a mine that is got, like it's a huge, like a surface area, you can employ a drag line, because then it moves quite a lot of volume at once. That big bucket of a drag line, can move quite a lot of volume versus using, like a, loaders and trucks and so on. So that's basically what a drag line does.
Yes.
And
Okay.
it removes the overburden. Then it exposes the coal, okay, which is now point number 3, where the coal also gets, drilled, it's blasted, and then it's loaded onto the coal trucks to go to a processing plant. There is this huge coal trucks that you find, like either in coal mine, open cast, or even in your, chrome, like a coal mines. It's high volume, like trucks and so on. Because it's a volume business. It's how you can move the highest, volume economically and lessening the number of, like traveling times and so on. But that's basically the process of how you extract, the coal from surface until you reach the coal seam, loading it, and then depending what type of coal it is, you either process through crushing and screening, and which I think will come into the latter part and so on. Yeah. It depends on the in situ quality of that coal.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Mashiko. With your leave, I'm going to suggest that we pass over the process flow for underground, because as you've clarified, Brakfontein was not an underground mine. And then if we move over to slide 17, you there start addressing the question of coal quality parameters. There are 3 of those parameters which are particularly applicable in the Brakfontein context. That's CV, ash content, and sulfur. If you can start off by taking the chair through those qualities of coal.
Maybe for correction, all coal qualities are applicable throughout. But I think of interest in the Brakfontein, the quality parameters that stand out from a deviation perspective is indeed, like the energy content, what we call calorific value. That's basically a measure of how much energy, like you would get out of, like a kilogram of coal once it's combusted. And it's ash. Ash is basically the inorganic material. Remember, I mentioned earlier on that coal is formed from, like a carbon-bearing, flora and fauna, once, like they are, I think no longer, like life, for lack of a better word. And it gets contaminated with the rest of other sediments, like a rock and so on. That is inorganic. So the inorganic material, that is incombustible, is basically what comprises the ash component, of the ash. So the entire ore body, once you extract it, not all of it is combustible. So that is the ash content. So the higher
and the one that you are interested in is the combustible one, or not really? That you would be interested in?
All of it is important because, you use it to decide how you design the plant. But I think the relationship between ash and CV, which is ash incombustible, CV, which is combustible, the higher the energy content represented by the CV value, the lower the ash content. So there's an inverse relationship between energy content and ash. High ash content, type of ore bodies typically have lower, like energy content. So that's basically that particular resource. And the last one is sulfur. Sulfur is there, it's embedded, like in the coal. Different coal fields have got certain trends with regards to sulfur component. It's what nature has given us. And in around, like a Delmas, going towards, if you go slightly east towards the likes of Elof and, Brakpan area, those coal seams around Delmas or coal reserves, they tend to be, like a high in sulfur content and so on. So the geological model does point out, the type of coal that you find in different areas and what is the probability to find, like a sulfur. So inherently that coal, and Brakfontein particularly, has an inherent high sulfur content.
Okay.
Could you just address, sorry.
The sulfur, because once you combust the coal in a power station and the exhaust, like a fumes or what you call flue in the technical language that goes up, like the smoke chimneys. If you have high sulfur, like a content in your coal, once you combust, because you need air to support combustion, which has
Yes.
got oxygen, you get formation of sulfur oxides, which are greenhouse gases. So the higher the sulfur content, you're going to have higher sulfur oxides, and we are regulated to
Yes.
contain, sulfur oxides, like in
Yes.
that, That's
Yeah.
basically why it's important for sulfur to be determined. A power station is licensed, with regards to emissions, to be
Yes.
within certain boundaries, and sulfur
Yes.
is one of those,
Okay.
gaseous emissions that we manage here.
So just to clarify, if the sulfur content was higher than required, would that affect your emissions quota, so to speak, at the power plant?
Definitely, and I think our power plants are in general designed between 1% and 2%, a maximum, a sulfur content. There are other, consequences on the plant itself over and above the emissions, is that sulfur oxides, when they get hydrated, that is, if they get a certain amount of moisture, they start forming, sulfuric acid derivatives. And in your plant, at the back end, what we call back end, towards the exhaust part of the plant, if you start having low temperatures, you can start having corrosion, of that equipment. And where you've got filter bags to remove the ash particles, they also get compromised because of. So it affects the plant if it's in higher concentration, especially in winter, where the temperature drops, and it affects also the emission license to try and prevent sulfur oxides emissions, which are greenhouse gases.
Thank you. If you could just take a little bit more time on the impact to the power plant of coal that doesn't meet specification. You've told us in some detail what the impact of a higher sulfur quantity might be, but could you just spend a little bit more time on ash? What would be the effect of higher ash quantity than that which is stipulated on the power plant?
Yes. So the main reason we need coal is the CV, is to be able to combust it, get as much energy as possible to convert, that potential energy, heat up the water to produce steam that drives the turbine. That's, in a nutshell, the most part that we're interested in is the energy. So if the energy content is below what the power plant is designed for, so you would need more of that coal, basically, to achieve the same amount of, power output. So that's the first, compromise that you have on your plant. And the more coal you utilize to produce a single unit of power means you're going to have more handling of your residual, ash. The plant is also designed to handle a certain amount of ash. So it adds on the ash burden, a percentage, and also the wear patterns that you find inside your boiler, a combustion chamber. You design your plant to be within certain boundaries. So higher ash content, not good, because it's higher ash burden that you have to handle for a single unit of power, and you also have to burn more coal than it is desired. So it's an economic impact. And ash in itself, has got erosive, characteristics also, inside the boiler, which also impact, the longevity of the plant or your maintenance interval. You would end up, having your maintenance inspections much more frequently than you would if you had the desired, quality of coal. Hence, I'm using the energy and the ash interchangeably because the two go hand in hand. They are the inverse of each other. Yeah. That's the impact that you typically, get on the power plant.
So is there an average that you are able to give us to say, on average, you should have so much power units out of so much coal, or is that something that's what's expected if you have beyond so much coal but producing only so much unit power? Then it's economically not viable, or it's not good for Acecom and so on. Is that something that's easy to say or not really?
No, Chair, it is one of the considerations. You are spot on. It is basically the plant design. When you design the plant, you basically set out what is a type of fuel, meaning coal, that needs to be, utilized, and it's not an absolute, it's a range.
Yes.
And it must be within that range
Yeah.
to be able to achieve the desired output,
yeah.
with regards to energy. The moment you
Yes.
go outside that border, which we call coal quality specifications, you start having, impact and so on. So ideally, we would like to have as much higher energy content and lower ash content, to move higher up in the hierarchy, because there's less impact wear on the plant, and you use lesser, a coal to produce, a single. I can use the analogy of a car. It's
Yes.
better to use 95 octane on your
Yes.
car versus the older versions,
Yes.
because you
Yes.
get, more out of a single,
Yes.
unit of it. So
Yes.
the plant is designed for that.
Yeah.
And with the plant design specification, that's what we use commercially to go and source the coal.
Yes,
So
yes.
you can't change the plant design. Once the plant is built, it's there.
Yes, yes,
you can't
yes.
change it. So it is the coal quality that has to match that particular plant. And once, or in the event that the coal goes out of that plant design parameters, you start having negative, a consequence, as I've explained, earlier
Yes,
on.
yeah.
It is a design consideration.
Okay.
And when we design the plants, historically they were designed also on typical coal fields that you find, and it was an economic model that was used in South Africa to say use lower quality coal and export higher, a quality coal. So our plants were
Yes.
designed for a certain band, of quality, because coal is a high cost input in producing electricity. You reduce the cost of coal, you make electricity much more, affordable. So it is an economic,
Yes.
a consideration over and above
Yes.
just a technical specification.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Chair, if I may just suggest, in the light of your question, that we turn to file 4, because there we can actually have a look at the coal quality specifications in the Braakfontein Agreement, which, as Mr. Mashiko is describing, would be specific to Majuba Power Plant. If we go to page 890 in file 4, Mr. Mashiko, you can maybe open that out and then speak to...
Did you say 850?
Sorry, 890.
890.
Chair, just to orientate you in relation to that page, and it was an aspect that I intended to go through a bit later with Mr. Mashiko, but it seems appropriate now.
Yes.
This is a page within the coal supply agreement that was concluded with Tegeta for coal supplied from Braakfontein and to be supplied to Majuba Power Plant. And what you see on page 890 there at table 3 is what is headed coal quality specifications and rejection limits. So, Mr. Mashiko, just with reference to these quality specifications that are identified in your slide and what is set out in this table, could you take the chair through, for example, the calorific value that is stipulated? We then have moisture stipulated. We then have ash, which you've spoken a bit to us about. I'd also like you, if you could, to deal with abrasive index and what the implication of being out of specification on abrasive index is. But if you can just explain to the Chair how this table works on page 890.
Yeah. Thanks. Chair, this table is extracted out of the design basis of the plant. Our engineers continuously look at the age of the plant, the condition of the plant, and what the coal requirement is. So they take the broader design basis, look at the condition, and now and again will tell us, the people that source coal, to say this is the ideal coal that you need to source for this power plant to ensure that it performs within what it's designed for. So you see the unit measure, and then it's a quality expected. The quality expected is typically within a range. If we get this nominal quality, we are all okay. But we know coal mining is not like a cheese factory. There is variability in the coal. We also hedge ourselves to say, if the coal gets to a certain limit, you reject the coal, you can't take it. So energy, for example, you want, the limit is set on the lower end. You don't want the energy content to drop for Majuba below 20 megajoules per kilogram. So if the energy drops below 20 megajoules per kilogram, we can't take that coal to Majuba. So that's what basically the rejection limit is. Ideally, we would like to have coal on average at 21 megajoules per kilogram, like a CV. And if I can go straight to ash, because it relates to the
Yes.
calorific value, you can see with regards to ash, we expect a lower quality compared to the reject. So you'd want the ash to be around 27.9, but if your ash content goes up, beyond 30%, like of the total composition of the ash,
Yes.
you reject, like that part.
Okay.
The abrasive index, it's a phenomenon that says how, when your ash makes contact, or your coal, when your coal makes contact with the grinding materials, like in the plant, because we do grind the coal into a finer, powder less than 2 microns before we combust it in the boiler. We grind it to expose, like the surface area so that it combusts instantly and to release as much energy, unlike the old coal stoves where you put lumps. In this case, we grind it finer and so on. So what happens is that now in the grinding plant of the power station, if your coal's got a high abrasive index, it means the abrasion or the erosion phenomenon increases. So you wear your grinding material much quicker than they're supposed to in terms of the design life, and also the transportation pipes that takes the pulverized coal into the boiler for combustion. That network of pipework also will be compromised, including the burners themselves, where the coal basically gets combusted when it gets into the boiler. So that whole value chain in the coal handling becomes compromised if the abrasiveness index is expressed as an element of iron loss in the material. That's why it says Fe. Fe, it's a chemical formula, representing, iron, the ferrous basically. That's what abrasiveness index is. You would like to have it as low as possible, ideally around 450. It goes beyond 450 milligrams of iron erosion of your components, then the coal you basically reject. And similarly, things like moisture, you have moisture that is inherent in the coal. It's there, it's what nature has given you. But there's also other moisture that comes onto the surface of coal because of weather elements and so on. That is easy to expunge, and so on. But the inherent moisture is what goes through, into the boiler. We also do measure that and so on. But the total moisture is to manage the handleability, of the coal when you move it, in the value chain, into the boiler and so on. So all these quality parameters are supposed to meet the contractual limits, because the contractual limits are linked to what the plant is designed for. If we don't get the coal of the quality band, then it compromises the ability of the power plant to produce, and it also compromises the integrity of the plant, hence the reliability and availability of the plant gets affected by coal.
Mr. Mashiko, if we can then go to slide 20, which deals with coal beneficiation being used to obtain the varying qualities of coal. Can you just explain to us how beneficiation is used to attain the coal quality parameters in terms of an agreement with Acecom?
I think beneficiation is used, interchangeably in the industry, because some people, when they talk beneficiation, is converting an ore body into a value-adding product. But with coal here, when we refer to beneficiation, it's basically enhancing the quality component of the coal, and mainly the energy, a component. So when you mine the coal and it has a lower energy content, you've got options to can enhance that energy component by eradicating part of your inorganic material, which is incombustible. So post-mining, let's go back to that process I mentioned earlier, that the coal gets exposed, it gets blasted, and once it's blasted and it's loaded onto trucks, it's big lumps, like a boulder, some of them as big as this table and so on. Then it goes to a processing plant where you crush it to size to be able to be utilized in the power plant. But if the quality of the coal does not meet the requirement, then you've got an option, beyond the crushing and screening, to do what we call coal washing or destoning. And there are different mechanisms of that, but all you do is you're removing a certain amount of the incombustible material in the coal to enhance the energy content. So your ash will drop, your energy content will move, but you do it economically, and get a certain yield, because the more you wash, your yield becomes low, it becomes uneconomic, to produce that coal. So that's basically the beneficiation, is to enhance the quality from the in situ. If you get coal that is sitting at about 18 CV, but you want to get it to 21 CV, you definitely, employ one of the technologies to remove stone and incombustible material before you ship the coal out of the colliery. And it becomes a huge processing plant where you basically, wash the coal and so on, yeah. It's called coal washing, but it's much more technically engaging, but I think washing is probably the easiest, term to use to do that, yeah. And the graphic shows you that in the coal washing process, they use what you call dense medium. Your incombustible material will sink to the bottom, and your high carbon component part of the coal will float, and that's what you skim off, and it's high quality. You discard, the part that sinks at the bottom of the high medium material.
Thank you, Mr. Mashiko. What I'd now like to move to is the process for sampling of coal. There isn't, in fact, a slide that deals with that, but I do know that you're given to drawing diagrams where necessary, so we've provided you with a whiteboard for that purpose and some pens. If you wouldn't mind taking the chair through precisely how sampling works at a plant, the process for sampling, so that the quality of the coal can be determined. And if you could just use the handheld mic for that purpose, that would be great.
Is it on? Yeah. I'll confess that my graphic skills are very elementary. I don't want architects and drafters to come after me. I'm going to do single line.
You might be needing graphics 101 as well.
I probably do, Chair. I probably do. So I'm going to do single line representation, and yeah. So if we assume this is basically, the pit, in which the mining happens. So the coal gets, extracted. You have your trucks that carry coal, to a processing plant. That's probably, step one. Then when you get to the processing plant, the coal gets crushed, to size. As I mentioned here, you get sizes as big as 100 millimeters, of coal, that is produced. You need to, bring it down to size. It makes it economic to transport because larger volumes occupy higher volume. You can't move critical mass, in that process. The smaller the particle size, you can load more, whether you're transporting by rail, road, conveyor. So when you get to the processing plant, which is step 2, you crush the coal, to size. And if the plant has got a washing facility, you'd wash it and so on. So all the process takes place in the mine. The miner looks after, I'm just going to put here processing, which is crushing, screening, and then washing, whether it is optional or it's part of the design based on the ore body that is mined out. So that the miner controls, you get a certain product, out of this process. Then comes the part where we do quality determination. The miner already knows from the drilling, from their geological model, what is sitting in situ here, and hence they can design this particular process. To say, I'm sitting with this type of coal, this is how I'm going to handle the coal. From the processing plant, normally the conveyance of coal is mechanical via conveyor belts. So this will basically represent, for me, a conveyor belt. So you're coming from a plant, you would have typically a silo here, which is basically for surge capacity, to make the continuous running of the plant, through. So the thing will put into a funnel, which you call a coal chute, and the coal gets thrown onto the conveyor. So the conveyor is going that particular direction. The arrow just basically shows which direction the conveyor goes. And somewhere here you see it, with a pulley, because there is a drive somewhere here that basically runs the conveyor. So there is coal on top of this particular conveyor. So what happens is that on this conveyor, so this is basically now conveyance from the processing plant. So let's call it step 3. So onto, where the coal is going to be either loaded, stockpile, and so on. So you've got options here. You're either stockpiling it in the mine, or it's loaded directly onto a train, or you load onto a truck. And so if it's a stockpile, you will have, this is basically how we represent a stockpile. So that will be a coal stockpile. For our purposes, where we pre-certify the coal, our stockpile will range between 3 and 10 kilotons. It is mainly to make sure that the coal, that is here is represented. You can sample it much easier, and the sample that you take is a representative sample of what is here, because these are solid state. It's not like your water, or gaseous material and so on. So on this conveyor, okay, you would install what we call an automechanical sampler. And I will go to maybe just break it down further. So from processing, you go into a conveyor, but before you can stockpile the coal, you would have a mechanism here called a automechanical sampler. So I'm going to drill down a bit on what the automechanical sampler does. So on this particular conveyor, there will be an automechanical sampler. For ease of reference, there will be what we call a belt cutter. It's a mechanism. So this automechanical sampler sits on top of, of a conveyor. Over a period of time, it will do what we call belt cuts. So, that arm or mechanism lever will push over, the coal off the conveyor, and the conveyor, and this thing will drop through a chute onto a bin here. Okay. So this is a splitter, and then you got your bin. So there's a conveyor continuously. This is continuous. So it is set, over a period of time. So within 24 hours, this auto sampler, or if it's creating a 3 kiloton stockpile, you'll work out, the amount of, the frequency at which this belt, lever is supposed to push coal over, which falls into this chute, and then you've got a splitter, you get 2 samples. So it's a cumulative sample over a period of time while you're building up the stockpile. No human interface, it's systematic, and behind, the time sits a statistical model that tells you how many belt cuts, what should be the size of the sample that will represent that particular sample. So this is important. That particular sample, one will be a contractual sample that goes to a nominated lab. And the other sample, goes to the mine. So we split that particular sample. So this is a contractual sample. It goes to the lab. When it arrives at the lab, it gets registered. They split it further, for a sample that will be used, in the lab to do analysis, and the other one is a reference sample that we keep for 30 days in case there are disputes about whether the analysis was accurate, and so it becomes more backup. The mine will do its own analysis at their own lab, and they usually compare against this, but the payment is made on the contractual sample, which is taken to a contractual lab. That in a nutshell, Chair, but I think what Ms. Hofmeyer was trying to say is, what is the purpose of this? If you don't have this, what happens is that now, okay, this is now with automechanical sampler. I'm going to be grilled by my colleagues when I get back to it. Okay. Let's call this now illustration 5. Still the same conveyor. This represents coal. This is now your stockpile. Now, if you don't have an automechanical sampler to take and automatically to sample this coal as it creates this particular stockpile, you have to go onto the stockpile and manually, take samples at different, elevation to get a representation, the depth in which you take the sample as well. So it is prone to errors, and it is post the creation of the stockpile. So what we do in the contracts, especially when it's a new operation, the miner is getting up, we allow for about 3 months, for a miner to set up, processes, put in an automechanical sampler, calibrate it, to ensure there is no bias, then put it onto commercial operations, then we move. So we do say there is a risk period, but you lessen it to about 3 months, where you can do, a manual sampling, but this manual sampling is also ISO, it has to follow ISO protocol. So the standards are set. It's a well-established industry. We've got standard standards, through the SABC. We've got ISO international standards from Europe. You've got also ESME, the American. So it's a well-established industry on how you do sampling that will be representative of, this. Your sample typically is about, a 3 kilogram. So you can imagine if you take a 3 kilogram sample of a 3,000 kilogram, a consignment, it's relatively, and this 3 kilogram sample, when you go into a lab to do those edge, CV, moisture, you basically use 1 gram. So you can see how your risk basically over, the whole process, changes, which is why the preference and the standard is to have an automechanical sampler to avoid human errors or bias or malfeasance if you have people that don't have scruples.
No, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mashiko. That, if you'll just give me 1 moment. Chair, we'd like to admit those 4 pages as an exhibit. What we propose to do is to reduce them in size by a photograph and then a reduction so that they can be placed in our files in due course.
Yes.
May I propose that we label them U4B? We don't have a U4B yet.
Do we have an A?
We have an A because that is the slides that
okay.
Mr. Mashiko prepared for us.
Yes, we can do that. I don't know whether, as he was writing, he knew that this is what would happen, and therefore I don't know whether he wrote with a handwriting that's legible, but he will be available to assist you with his handwriting if he can read it.
Indeed. I think I was able to make out most of it, so we'll be able to provide a sort of key for the reader in due course.
So we have our own disabilities, and I think handwriting is one of mine.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Mashiko, that, unless there's anything else you'd like to add, I would propose concludes the background setting section of your evidence. I'd now like to get into some of the detail about the Braakfontein contract itself. Okay. For that purpose, if I could take you in file 3 to a part of your statement which begins at page 136.
Help me with an
136.
136. Okay.
So just to orientate you, this commences paragraph 5 of your statement, and you'll see that it's headed Tegeta Braakfontein Colliery Contract Award Evolution. And if you go down to 5.2 there, you deal with the onboarding process for Tegeta, and you record there that Primary Energy concluded the Tegeta Braakfontein Colliery contract under the 2008 mandate. Do you see that?
Yes, I can see that.
I'd now like to take you to the 2008 mandate so that we can discuss it in some detail. You'll find the 2008 mandate in file 4 at page 693.
I'm on page 693.
Thank you. You'll see that the mandate commences at 693, and runs for 3 pages to 695. And then at 696 commences a checklist. I'm going to deal with both of those documents with you in a moment. Can you just give us the context to what this mandate was all about in 2008 in Eskom?
Chair, I think running from 2007 to 2008, marked by the load shedding we had from January 2008, and it went on up to, May, if I'm talking under correction, the period, we had rotational load shedding in 2008. One, over and above the plant performance issues we had, we also had, typically 1 in a 50-year rain, a storm, prevalence. So we had unphenomenally high rainfall, in 2008. We also had, coal shortages in 2008. So there was a coal emergency declared in Eskom to fill the gap of the coal requirement at that point in time. So, and the shortage of coal does not happen overnight. I think it comes progressively, but with the mines production affected by rain and so on, it just worsened, the situation. So Eskom declared a coal emergency. The team in 2008 went out to source, a coal on a very, very urgent basis to ensure, a continuity of supply. What the team did as well, they approached the board tender committee with a mandate to allow them to conclude contracts in a particular manner for the next 10 years in an attempt to avoid a repeat of what they experienced from 2007 and 2008 with regards to coal shortages. That's in a nutshell the rationale why the 10-year 2008 mandate, it had a particular amount of, a volume. I think it was 490, a million tons that they sought approval to purchase in a particular, a manner, whereby you don't necessarily have to go through adjudication. So you get upfront, approval to go conclude, a contracts. You can receive unsolicited bids, but it was to expedite the process of concluding coal contracts and do it over a period of 10 years, avoiding a repeat. And the premise was also, the time will also be used to conclude long-term coal contracts. So it was to deal with the short and medium term, coal shortages. That in a nutshell, Chair, was the rationale why the 2008 mandate was concluded, which gave the Primary Energy Division the ability and flexibility to conclude coal contracts for a certain amount, for a certain value and a volume of coal for all power stations that had a coal shortage, and utilizing the quality criteria as I've highlighted in the example that I've given, without going through, an adjudication process. However, it was allowed, if they wanted to issue open tender RFPs, they could do that. If they wanted to do confined sourcing, they can do that. If they wanted to entertain what we call unsolicited bids from suppliers, they could do that. The process of concluding coal contracts, you need to make sure it's, the pricing is fair, the quality meets the criteria. The Chair is in a nutshell what this mandate was all about.
If we just go to paragraph 2.1 on page 693, confirm for me if I'm correct, but that seems to capture what you've described as being the rationale. What was resolved was that approval be and is hereby given to negotiate and conclude contracts on a medium-term basis for the supply and delivery of coal to various Eskom power stations for the period October 2008 to March 2018. So that's effectively the 10 years you were speaking about. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And then your reference to 490 million tons is in the second line there. The required volume of coal will be 490.8 million tons. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And just to clarify what this meant in terms of processes for procurement within Eskom, I understand you to say this was a delegation in and of itself of an authority to enter into these contracts. Is that correct?
Yes.
And it did not need to go through a tender adjudication process. Is that correct?
That's correct, because it's an upfront approval.
Thank you. If we can then move to the checklist, that is at page 696. What was this checklist intended to do?
Okay. The checklist is basically a control sheet that accompanies a submission, especially submissions that go to the executive committee, subcommittees and committees, board committees and subcommittees, and it is incumbent on the then, I think we call them MDs, they evolve over time, but a divisional executive is accountable basically to sign off the submission that goes to those particular committees and so on. And I think this one was signed by Mr. Dames when he was the chief officer for the generation business, yeah, which is a level of a GE in current terms.
Mr. Mashiko, if from 2008, this mandate allowed Eskom to procure one-on-one and to receive unsolicited bids for coal supply, what protections were put in place to ensure regularity in the process of procurement?
What they did, and I'm talking about an era, part of I was not involved, and some of I was. As I mentioned earlier, RFPs were also allowed. There is quite a sizable amount of this coal that, even though the mandate was given for one-on-one, in the latter years of this mandate, I think post 2010, the more common practice was to either issue open tender RFPs, whereby you still within the mandate, you follow that process. However, the adjudication will be as delegated, like to the divisional executive. That is the one, I think, control, that was used. And, reference was also made to previous, contracts that were concluded. And I must state, however, there were unsolicited bids that within the period, 2010 and 2018, that were allowed. The delegation to the chief officer generation, which I think subsequently, with the amendments that were made to this mandate, which were given later to the GE, it was incumbent on them to ensure that the process, was fair, and Eskom, pays, what is, I would say, deemed fair from a pricing perspective, whereby the execution was given to the senior general manager, the head of primary energy. So the sourcing team would go do, the work led by the general manager. However, the authorization of the contracts and so on was segregated, from them and basically signed off by the, then we had a divisional executive, a primary energy before 2015.
And in March 2015, who would that person have been in Eskom?
In March 2015, we had Mr. Vusimboweni.
Thank you. This medium-term mandate was then amended in 2010. I'd like to take you to that amendment. If we go to 742 of the same file,
I'm on page 742.
Sorry, let me take you back just so I can orientate you as to where it starts. It starts at 738. The relevant page I want to take you to in due course is 742. But if we start at 738, you'll see that that's reflected as the minutes of a special board tender committee meeting held on Friday, the 3rd of December 2010.
Yes.
Ms. Mashiko, as a precursor to the questions that will follow, can you confirm that the 2008 mandate that we've just looked at allowed contracts to be concluded until 2018? Is that correct?
It was quite specific. It was specific volume, limited value, and limited tenure. So it was quite specific.
And then if you go to 742, that is the section of the minutes that reflects what was resolved by the board tender committee. And what I'm interested in there is point 3. Can you tell us how point 3 changed the arrangement from what it was under the original 2008 mandate?
So the original mandate was to cover a period of 10 years, which meant you can only conclude contracts using this mandate. The contracts should not go beyond, I think, 31st March 2018. So it was a 10-year period. So what this resolution, based on what the team sought, was to allow for the team to conclude contracts for the life of the mine, whereby the bidders have, or the mine bid would say, I can offer you coal, and that life of mine goes beyond the 31st March 2018. That's basically, in essence, the one of the key changes that happened, in
2010, as I have it,
yeah, that's
the 3rd of December.
Yes, that's a 2010 resolution that was made. Yeah.
And then can you also just tell us about what point 2 is doing there? It begins with, the divisional executive is granted the power to delegate further the following contingencies to be executed by means of delegation consent forms for contracts already agreed. And then 2.2 says that this power will encompass increase the value of individual contracts concluded by not more than 10% of the original contract value, capped at 500 million, and will not exceed the overall approved mandate. What does that mean?
Yeah. All it meant then was, if a contract is concluded and there was scope to expand, the contract, that is add additional, a volume, which will mean, also the value of the contract increase, was to have the divisional executive granted the permission to can authorize those particular, expansion. In the construction, if I can use construction contracts, you would also have what we call a contingency in case you have, a variation in scope, or, the volume is much higher than was originally anticipated. You'd have that risk allowance, normally set about this, industry norm is about 10%, I think. For a contract manager, when they come across those type of, eventualities that have been identified in their risk profile to do that. They did a similar thing with the coal supply agreement to say, where you have existing contracts and there is scope to expand, you can expand to a certain limited. So it can only be maximum of 6 months, I think, the tenure, and the value of the contract also has to be kept. That is now I think it's still that the contract should not be more than 10%. And however, where the 10% may be higher because the base contract was higher, it should not exceed, I think, 500 million. Those are, I think, the controls that were put in.
So if a contract that existed after 2010 was sought to be extended beyond the limits placed here, would there have been any authority for that to be concluded within Eskom?
The authority would then go to the committee that authorized the mandate, and not the people that were given a task to execute the limited authority. The norm is you always go back to the delegated authority in terms of a committee. However, the divisional executive would not have the capacity to basically authorize, for example, 12%, contract expansion, or where the value goes beyond 500, or the tenure goes beyond 6 million. They would have to go back to the board tender committee that authorized this.
Thank you. Mr. Mashiko, I'd then like to go to the coal supply agreement that was concluded with Tegeta in relation to the Brakfontein mine. You will find that in file 4, which is in front of you, and it commences at page 857.
I am on page 857.
Can you confirm that that is the coal supply agreement between, for the Brakfontein colliery and extension between Eskom and Tegeta? If you'd like to see the signature page,
yes, that's where
that's
I'm
at
going
920.
Okay, 10th of March is the time.
Yes.
Yes, and Mr. Mboweni was the acting divisional executive at that point in time.
And who does he sign for?
He's signing on behalf of Eskom.
And who's signed on behalf of Tegeta, as reflected on that page?
It's Mr. Ravindra. I'm going to assume it's Mr. Ravinath. It's Mr. Ravindranath.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If we can then go back to that first page, 857, I drew a distinction in the overview I provided at the commencement of today's hearing between the Braakfontein Colliery and the Braakfontein Colliery extension. What do you understand that difference to be?
The Braakfontein Colliery was the operation that was in existence at the point of signing the contract. The extension from the mine planning is what was planned, as the mine, developed, to say at a certain point in time, they would access, because they have mineral rights, for that portion, of the mine. It's a separate farm. Is that at that particular point in time, when they get to that, then they will start mining that part. However, what was contracted at this point in time was the main colliery that was active at that point.
So can I just confirm, in terms of the coal quality that would then have been tested when the contract was concluded, was the coal in the extension tested at that stage?
No, it was not. They only tested the existing, colliery. I don't even think they had a geological, a sample and results out of the extension.
Thank you. If we can then go to page 879. 879 contains the condition precedent that I also referred to in the overview, which I said did not reflect customary lawyer language. You'll find it at the bottom of page 879.
Under section 10.
Under clause 10, indeed. And if I may just read it into the record, Chair, because it is very important in the context of this case. The parties agree that this agreement will be subject to the fulfillment or waiver of the following conditions precedent. 10.2, in respect of the supplier. And then 10.2.1, by no later than 1600 hours on 31 March 2015, the supplier had completed and reported a successful combustion test for coal supply to Majuba Power Station. Then goes on at 10.3. It is specifically recorded that if the conditions precedent are not fulfilled or waived on or prior to the applicable date referred to in clause 10.2.1, the remaining provisions of this agreement shall never become effective. In such event, neither party shall have any claim of any nature against the other. What was this condition precedent concerned with, Mr. Mashiko?
As highlighted in my statement with the evolution of the contract, that was, I think, file 3, page 136, because I still have it open. There were numerous attempts to test, the coal, the Braakfontein coal, and those tests have revealed there were major concerns, especially those 3 parameters I've mentioned: energy content, CV, as we trivially call it CV, ash content, and sulfur. So the team, because of the known history of that particular resource, wanted, wanted the coal to be combustion tested. Combustion testing is beyond what we do in a lab. So Acecom has got a research facility in Rocheville, Cleveland, Rocheville. They've got a research facility where we've got a pilot scale combustion test rig. And what happens is that the coal gets combusted in there, and analysis is done on how the coal behaves in there. It gets compared with the combustion requirement of a particular power plant. So typically the coal from Braakfontein will be taken, put in this combustion test rig. The mine is expected to provide that particular sample. The coal gets combusted. The results are compared to how the coal behaves in their plant. This is beyond the lab, testing and so on. And that then gets given to the power station. If it's within that particular, realm, then the contract, can proceed. That was basically a precaution based on the history of the previous attempts, that showed that the coal failed on those particular, I think we did submit that evidence.
Thank you. And then if you go over the page to 880, you'll see at the bottom of that page, table 1 reflects what's called the contract coal supply schedule.
Well, before you proceed,
yes.
I know that you did say that this was put in by people who are not lawyers, but they were quite clear why they wanted it in.
Chair, let me be clear. There was legal assistance in
Oh.
the formulation of the agreement.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I was seeking to signify that the importance of this condition to the technical people within Eskom is
Yes.
signified by some of the language used,
Yes.
which is not typically lawyerly.
Yes.
That was the point I sought to convey.
Well, I'm just thinking about what it means. 10.1, subject to the fulfillment or waiver of the conditions. Isn't it that normally, if it's a condition precedent, it just has to happen? If it doesn't happen, then the contract doesn't take effect.
Indeed.
So I'm just wondering whether the inclusion of waiver there doesn't tend to be contradictory to the normal sense of a condition precedent.
Chair, I think
That may be something that, if need be, one can talk about it later, but I was just trying to look at it against what they clearly were trying to achieve.
Chair, if I may say two things in that regard. The investigation has not indicated any waiver of the condition. So as a matter of fact, it is not the case that Eskom waived it. So that might take away the linguistic and interpretive question. But over and above that, even if we stay at the level of interpretation, my submission would be the reference to, over the page, this contract never coming into existence, never becoming effective,
Yes.
is a clear indicator that what the purpose behind this condition was that you've got to have a successful combustion test by 4 o'clock on the 31st. Otherwise, in essence, the parties walk away from one another.
Yeah. What it does emphasize, simply from the language point of view, is that probably waiver was a wrong word there. It doesn't seem to be consistent with what was intended as reflected in the first, on the next page.
Indeed.
At the top. Yeah. Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. We were going over the page to page 880, Mr. Mashiko, and you see at the bottom there the table specifying the contract coal supply schedule. Can you just take us through how we are to understand that supply schedule, insofar as the periods for the agreement are concerned, and in terms of the monthly quantity that was required to be produced by the Brakfontein mine?
Let me first start by explaining maybe something that is on 10.4 to say this is an energy-based contract. So
On 10 point?
Same page, just above the table.
Yes, okay.
You'll see it talks about the total contract quantity, and it talks about mega gigajoules. Yeah, I'm trying to explain that it's an energy-based contract. Energy means, how much energy you're going to get out of the total coal that is supplied.
Yes.
And it is assumed that energy comes at the nominal energy content. Remember the 21.1 I've mentioned.
Yes.
So when you do that, you get to that particular value. Then we convert that into tons.
Okay.
Yeah. So
okay.
I'm just clarifying that so that when I navigate between we don't get lost why we're referring to energy and and yet when we measure the coal, over a weight bridge, it's mass. It is not energy based and so on. Yeah. But it's because you would also derive back. To that, you'll take the mass that's delivered, the quality, then you multiply, you get the total energy in that particular coal consignment. Yeah. So what the contract does is that you can see it's set up as a ramp up. So there's a period between April 2015, when the contract comes into effect after being signed on the 10th of March, to September 2015, and it shows basically what will be the monthly, a quantity, the minimum and the maximum. And the monthly quantity, as you can see on column 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, on column 5, if you look at row 2, which says period April 2015, it's about 65. If you go to the next period, which is October 2015 to September 2020, the volume increases like a 213. This is now the nominal volume, and it shows that the minimum, like a quantity will be 90, kilotons per annum, or 90,000 tons per annum. Per month. My apologies. And the maximum volume will be 135. From October 2020, you get a, more or less, like the same quantum of volume, delivered. And beyond that, you don't have anything. So it's broken down into 3 tranches. So basically, it's your ramp up until you get to steady state. And as we can see, steady state was expected to be a volume of 113 kilotons per month supplied from this particular colliery.
Mr. Mashiko, the period October 2015 to September 2020 and the period October 2020 to September 2025, on my understanding, doesn't change at all in this table. It remains entirely consistent. Can you shed any light as to why those periods were separately identified in the agreement?
I can't, vouch for that, but what I can see is that you've already achieved, like a steady state, but why it was, categorized like that, I can't vouch for that.
We'll deal with that in the evidence of Mr. Bester, who's coming next week, Friday. He may be able to assist us there. Right, if we could then move to the question of technical compliance, which is at 886.
I'm on page 886.
If you go to clause 14 there, that clause is referring to the technical compliance requirements of the agreement. If I just quote that clause, it's not particularly long. The contract coal is to be supplied from both Braakfontein and Braakfontein Colliery Extension, must at all times comply with Eskom's technical and coal supply requirements. For the avoidance of any doubt, if these requirements do not render compliance for supply to Majuba Power Station, Eskom reserves the sole and exclusive right to call upon a material breach as more fully provided for in this agreement and exercise its rights accordingly. Mr. Mashiko, is that a standard term of Eskom's coal supply agreements?
I would like to believe so, Chair. And this is now post, like a contract commencement to ensure that we meet, the compliance and assurance that the quality will respect. So there are things that we put as controls to achieve that, It is standard requirement.
And Mr. Mashiko, is it fair to say that the...
Well, maybe let's clarify that you say you'd like to believe so. I think what Ms. Hofmeyr is more interested in is, based on your own experience, is it normal to find this kind of clause?
It is normal standard practice.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Chair. And you gave evidence earlier where you spoke about the impact of out-of-specification coal on a power plant. Do those concerns lie behind a clause like this in an agreement?
Amongst other things, yes. I may have not even highlighted the other part, which is the volume in itself. Because this being a pre-certified contract, it means if the coal does not meet the requirement, once the technical requirements are met, you will not be able to dispatch any coal to Majuba. However, in your planning, like a realm, you would have provided for that coal to come through. And if the coal doesn't come to Majuba, then you start having other undesired impact that Majuba doesn't have sufficient coal to provide. I did not mention that, but there is also that particular impact. And hence it's important upfront for those technical requirements to be firmed up, because it gives Eskom an assurance that what we contract for, it is deliverable. So we hedge ourselves both on the quality, mitigating those impacts on plant, etc., but also on the security of supply. Because if the mine is incapable of delivering the coal, it creates problems. Like on the security of supply, then on a short notice, we have to go around, looking for coal to replace this particular consignment.
Mr. Mashiko, you've raised the issue of pre-certified stockpile. Can I take you to the provision of the agreement that deals with that? It's at page 892. You'll see at clause 20...
what page?
892, Chair.
Oh, okay, thank you.
That page contains clause 21, which deals with pre-certification of coal. And what I'm interested in, Mr. Mashiko, is clause 21.2. What does that clause tell us?
This is what we term contractual coal. That is, for coal to be dispatched to a power station, in this case from Braakfontein Mine to Majuba Power Station, it should have been pre-certified and it should meet all the contractual specifications. And once that coal meets that requirement, that means it's green, it's ready to go, and we call it contractual coal. If the coal does not meet that requirement, it is not deemed contractual coal, so you can't dispatch that particular coal. That's, I think in a nutshell, that's what it means. So the process is, there's a process to pre-certify. I think I've explained the process, how we obtain a sample, but the important part is once the sample is analyzed, you go back to the contractual qualities. Does it meet all the contractual qualities? If yes, because the accountability sits with the mine to load the coal and dispatch, that it must always meet the contractual requirement. If it does not, that coal is not deemed contractual, then other contractual remedies are applied.
And Mr. Mashiko, would it be fair to say that this contract does not envisage coal that has not been pre-certified leaving the gates of the mine?
Absolutely. It is a mechanism that was devised because of the complexity of delivering coal by road. If the contract is complied to fully by both parties, you should not have quality issues when coal is received at the power station.
Let's just pause for a moment about the world in which the contract isn't being implemented properly. With a power station like Majuba, that, as you've already indicated in your evidence, receives coal from numerous sources, how does it identify if there are coal quality problems that it is detecting on its end, where the source of that coal comes from?
Firstly, your boiler is the best analyzer you can get. Your boiler will tell you if the coal that is coming in, is substandard in this particular case, that is outside spec. So that's the first point we'll pick up, whether it's physical, attributes of the coal, or is the chemical properties when the coal is combusted. And once we identify that, the power station says we have an issue, we're not getting the output that we require, or we're getting other undesired, aspect, the coal does not combust at all, or we have too much ash that we need to handle, or we have too much abrasion, or there's too much foreign material. So depending on what parameter is it. Then we start with the process of elimination, where each and every single source that is delivered to a power station, if it comes on road, every single truck is sampled based on the stockpile that was dispatched at the source to do, analysis. And that's how we normally, would do the process. I mentioned earlier, Majuba would on any given day, have on average 10 contracts. And those 10 contracts have to deliver in the range of about 40,000 tons per day. Part coming through by train, on average 25,000 tons by train. The balance come, through road. And that's, more than 500 truck deliveries, per day that we have. So every single truck will have to be, sampled to create a cumulative stockpile per source. Then they do the analysis, and it will pinpoint which coal source is problematic. Then we start going, backwards to the supplier.
Ms. Mashiko, but given your description of the role that pre-certification plays in these contracts, sounds to me like this process of having to identify which particular coal source is the problematic one is an onerous one for Eskom to undertake. Is that a fair comment?
It is indeed, because the cost of doing that exercise also is borne solely, by Eskom, and it is undesired, because your pre-certification, if it's done properly, and people are with scruples, on the whole value chain, you should not theoretically end in a situation where you have to do that. Yeah.
Thank you. If we go back 2 pages to page 890, this is the page we looked at previously that sets the coal quality specifications and rejection limits for Majuba. What I'm interested in is an aspect of this page that we didn't touch on earlier. You'll see below the table at table 3, there are some italicized sentences. The second of those, well, the one with 2 asterisks, is the one that I'd like you to provide us with comment on. Can you please first just read into the record what those 2 asterisks provide?
As mentioned earlier, this, you want me to cover both or just the second one?
Just the second one for now.
The second one relates to the full combustion test. As I've explained earlier, Chair, the combustion test is a small-scale simulation of how the coal will behave once it's combusted, compared relatively to what will happen in the power plant. And this is to deal with the suitability of coal. As over and above what we do in the lab test, which we call proximate analysis, there are certain things about coal. Coal can melt, and then when coal starts melting, which means now the melting point of your ash is lower than what the furnace temperature is, it starts creating, handling problem. You have to shut down machines, or coal doesn't combust at all. You have what we call flame outs, and then basically it switches off. It's like your car switching off completely because it is not firing, whether it's your your spark plugs not working or your injectors. It's a similar thing. If coal is not reactive, or coal reacts very slowly, your furnace works on a time perspective. A power station like Majuba would have in excess of 300 kilograms per second of coal that is fed into the boiler at any given point in time, and it is fed as a pulverized medium. And if that coal reacts slowly, which means you're going to have combustion happening in the places of your boiler where it's not supposed to happen, creating undesired consequences. So it is ash melting, it is ash, coal not combusting properly, causing flame outs, because flame outs it's also a high risk, because if the coal reignites, you can have uncontrolled explosion of boilers, and we've had those globally. Fortunately, in South Africa, we haven't had in the Acecom fleet a catastrophic explosion, of a boiler. So all these things are meant to ensure that over and above that, the CV is fine, the ash is okay, the sulfur is okay. It's how the coal behaves once you start combusting it, because it creates problems. And can the coal be handled? When it moves from the coal stockpile into the boiler, you don't have oversized, you don't have excess stones, they don't cause physical damage, ripping conveyor belts and so on. That's basically why we do, these particular physical tests and combustion test. But the combustion test is once this coal enters the boiler, because it's a black box, it is how does it behave and affect reliability, and availability of the plant.
Mr. Mashiko, if I can just read that double asterisk provision there into the record, it reflects full combustion tests will be conducted on all proposed coal prior to delivery and acceptance by Acecom. The objective of the combustion test is to ascertain suitability of the coal for use by Acecom. Just want to pause there for a moment. We previously looked at the combustion test in the context of the condition precedent. You'll recall that was clause 10, and that related to a successful combustion test that had to take place by the 31st of March 2015. That was prior to the effective date of the agreement. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. This provision seems, at least to the reader, to do something different. Would you agree with that? It refers to all proposed coal being subject to a combustion test. Is that a fair reading?
It does not contradict in my view. All it says is that prior to any coal that is supplied, to Acecom, you would have done a combustion test to check suitability. And one of the examples I can make, the coal can be suitable for Majuba from CV ash. However, from the reactivity, it's probably more usable at Tutuka. It is also to make those type of decisions and so on.
Indeed.
But I think that other clause was quite specific to hedge the implementation of the contract. Because it was not done upfront, traditionally you would have done the combustion test before we even signed the coal contract, because we would have identified at which power station is this coal suitable. And what we do also, we go to the general manager who's in charge of that particular asset and say, here's a coal source we've identified, here's the volume, here's the parameters, and here's a combustion test report, which is signed off by our research people. And the power station manager will give it to his combustion engineers, and they will say, yay, the coal is fine, we can receive it, or nay, before we even sign the contract. So this is not the normal flow of things, and as you can see, these clauses are added at various points of the contract in implementation, which should have been, upfront. Normally you front-end load this type of, requirements, because they form part of your technical evaluation when you still busy with the procurement process. And you can see this was, in my view, an effort to hedge further because the contract did not follow the normal evolution of contracting where the functional requirements precede even your price negotiation. Because if the functional requirements are not right, you don't even have to discuss the financial requirement because it does not meet the requirement. Immediately that particular bid or tender, becomes non-compliant and you don't even evaluate further and so on.
So this was an unusual clause in an agreement?
It is, because it's in an execution state.
Yes.
And it should be part of the requirements prior to contracting.
Okay.
Absolutely, Chair.
And just to pick up on the Chair's point there, I know that we're close to the lunch break, but full combustion tests on all proposed coal prior to delivery, it sounds like a considerable burden to place in a situation where you've described previously that pre-certification is supposed to deal with quality issues, right? The coal is not supposed to leave the mine unless it is pre-certified. That was your evidence. Is that correct, Mr. Mashiko?
Yes, that's correct.
This seems to be a clause that's saying, well, in addition to that, there must be full combustion tests on all coal prior to its delivery to Eskom. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think the language may present...
I guess you are asking whether that's a fair reading
yes, indeed.
of it, as
indeed.
opposed to whether it's fair
it
to
was
impose.
A fair, no,
to impose that.
Not at all. First of all, is that as you read it? Because if it is, then I'd like to ask some follow-up questions.
Yeah, as I read it, I think I would similarly have a similar interpretation. However, it is not practical. You can't every single ton of coal you take to a combustion test rig. The combustion test rig is done for the entire coal deposit. And hence I said you do it prior to contracting. Because it's an anomaly, you end up with clauses like this, trying to hedge in execution, because you still have, that debt that you did not pay at contracting. Now you're trying to do it in execution, but no, you can't every single time that the coal is dispatched, it goes to. It is not practical, but I can see what the intent is. That was to address something that should have been done at the front end of the contracting process.
Thank you, Mr. Mashiko.
So would you take the view that it was well intentioned, but at a practical level, there may have been practical difficulties complying with it in the way that is envisaged, or not really?
Chair, the literal meaning, as it stated, it says exactly there that you would have to do this combustion test for every coal consignment that goes. However, it's supposed to be for every coal contract or coal source that is brought in. You do a combustion test, because the combustion test is done for the entire deposit. So I certainly can tell that the intention was to protect their business. The execution in the language may present that practical. It is not practical, I can tell you. The combustion test rig, it takes you time to set it up, to get results. You will not be able to dispatch coal on a daily basis and so on.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. I have a few more questions in relation to the coal supply agreement before we move to another topic, but I'm happy to take the lunch adjournment now, if that would be suitable.
Yes, let's take the lunch adjournment now. We will resume at 2:00. We adjourn.